Father Giulio Maspero, who is a very old friend and used to teach at Santa Croce, but unfortunately he is now the dean, and it is probably a delight for him to be among us and give a paper to Giulio.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Luis. And so I'm a dean on holidays today. And I would like to share with you my approach to Nicaea, because the question that we all have is what can we say new about Nicaea? So we have worked so much and so much done on the sources. So my perspective, my attempt, my angle is using Chrêseis as a probe to explore the sources that we already know. And I will lean on what Samuel Fernandez is publishing, is going to explain, and so I will be quick on some passages because you know and you will discover more. And also this couple, orthopraxy and orthodoxy, is a sort of approach that I like, and in a sort of Balthasarian way I see a drama in that relationship, but we will see if you agree. So 3 steps. First of all, Chrêseis in the plural, so many uses, and I will explain this, then orthopraxy, and then orthodoxy, and we will try to see the relationship between the two. So first step, Chrêseis is a concept, a category developed a lot by Christian Nicaea from Münster, who passed away the 2nd of March this year. And for me it was a very deep approach that I'm trying to develop. For example, the idea is that human thought is always progressing through uses of previous categories, words, language is a sort of Chrêseis. We don't invent language, we receive language. Metaphysics itself is a sort of Chrêseis of previous myths that are reread in a different context. In Venice, we have the 4 horses that were brought from Constantinople, and they were used to express the fact that even if the people in Venice are very devout to St. Mark, the 4 Gospels are a unit, as a symphony. So the natural meaning, or the artful meaning of that piece of art is used to express a spiritual meaning. So it's like an exegesis. But there is also an unjust use Chrêseis that is typical in Rome. This is a small lane close to here, where a Roman column is used to substitute bricks. And so this is somehow a manipulation. It's not taking out the beauty of the color, it's just using in a functional way. So the importance of Chrêseis is that is related to me, in my perspective, to the fact that every text gets the meaning from the relationship with the context. So if you use something, you are changing the context, and you can change everything. You can get just something that is the contrary of the original meaning. And in 313, with the events of that year, there was the Edict of Milan. There was a new context, both political, cultural, theological, and on all the levels. And maybe what happened later in 317 with Eusebius, then in Alexandria, and at last in Nicaea with the Eusebius, in some sense is the result of this new context and the effects on the Chrêseis of the previous element. So there was a new context, and for example, the very council is a Chrêseis of a previous civil institution, and so they changed the context. And one clear example, in the Roman Senate, they used to put the statue of the goddess Victory in the center. In Nicaea, they put the Bible. So they were trying to change the meaning of this previous element that they were using through these movements. And the same happened in Nicaea with the rediscovered Basilica in 2014, because the Basilica was a civil building, and so it became a church. And I will try to use this example. So in my approach, there are multiple chrêseis in Nicaea at the political level, the level of justice, because this was the appeal for Eusebius, for previous condemnation in Antioch, at the level of architecture with the Basilica. Both Usia and Muzius are philosophical elements. The formulas X from X that are very well studied by Michel Barnes, and very influential later in the century. Also, is a matter of exegesis. We can use the Bible in a more literal way, in a more spiritual way, traditions, Antioch and Alexandria, and most of all, interpretations of origin, that maybe are the deepest level of the clash at Nicaea in my proposal, but we will see. So when we have a chrêseis, we can develop a just or an unjust use chrêseis, and between under the category of just chrêseis, we can go in the line of orthopraxy, on the line of orthodoxy. This can be compared to the German categories, and I received the influence of Alfons Fürst, of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So a Gemeinschaft is a community where the principle of unity is within the community itself. A Gesellschaft is like a company, is a community where the principle of unity is outside, the profit for a company. On the contrary, a Gemeinschaft is a family, the church is a Gemeinschaft. The unifying principle is within. And so, orthopraxy is more like Gesellschaft, orthodoxy is more like Gemeinschaft. This is the proposal of the approach. So we can change the context, and we can put the same text in the new context and get a different result, or we are obliged to change even the text to get something, as they did, for example, in the Council of Nicaea, putting the Bible in the center. So, let's move to orthopraxy, the first category that I'm trying to use. And I use the example of the rediscovered Basilica that I like much. I don't know if you have heard that Samuel Fernandez could go scuba diving in the Basilica. There's a picture. So I have the proofs. We will publish them. No, sorry. So what we know is that it's probable that in Nicaea there was a martyrium, a wooden church built where Saint Neophytus was received martyrdom in 303, and it's probable that the bishops convened there, according to Eusebius, who wrote that the beginning of the council was in one house of prayer, and the churches in Nicaea were small, and also. We have here in Rome, just around the corner, we could say this fresco that says that explains that the place was near to the shore of the lake and was circular. On the contrary, in Eusebius, the description in the central hall of the imperial palace fits with a rectangular space, so more like a civil basilica. It could be something like Piazza Armerina in Sicily. There was a villa of the governor of Sicily. This is the basilica, and also the description fits with both the dimension and the location within the palace. We have a terrific example in Trier that was built much bigger in 10 and 12 years before Nicaea. The throne room, so it could be possible that the basilica where the council convened was like that. But this is a church now, and when we see a basilica now, we think of the cathedral, where the symbol of faith is professed by the bishop together with the people. And this change, this shift in the meaning is due just to the movement for orthopraxy to orthodoxy, because Constantine was trying to help the bishops with a place that was fit for the discussions, also maybe to control a little bit these strange, weird people who were discussing too much and spending time on philosophical issues and not thinking about pronoia and peace and so on. So, when we match one context with the text, the same text, Basilica, we get different meanings, an orthopraxy or orthodoxy. And as we know from the letter to Arian and Alexander, sorry for the mistake, Constantine was not in favor of the discussion, so he didn't read the depth of issues, and he was reproaching both Arian and Alexander for discussing like philosophers. And this is also interesting because stressing too much the homoousios, in my opinion, is wrong. Because, for example, in 303, the last great persecution was also promoted by Neoplatonist philosophers. We know it for sure in Nicaea. They asked the emperor to start the persecutions, and the emperor was against philosophy, so it would be quite strange to think of influence of philosophy on the biblical message, in my opinion, from the historical perspective. What is more interesting to me is that we have light from light, phos ex photos, that is both a theological and a philosophical element that was used in theology, was present in Hippolytus, as we will see, was present in Plotinus, and became the key, the center of the discussion somehow. And why? Because light from light can be understood from a perspective of metousia, from participation, as Origen did, and as Eusebius was doing, or it could be used to express relation. But relation was changing. Relation at the beginning was related, sorry for the play, was related to participation too, but to express the fact that there is a homotimia between the Son and the Father, it had to change the meaning. And so, this is a text by Hippolytus, comparing light from light to water from spring, so it's a typical image, common in the Syriac tradition, common in the Semitic layer, backdrop, and we have life from life, and light from light in Plotinus. And we know that in Eusebius, both derivative formulas are quite common, are repeated, and so there is something here. My question is, was light from light going in the direction of Hippolytus or in the direction of Plotinus? This is what, because in Plotinus, the second light is always inferior, as in Plato, the image is always less than the prototype. And so, this is in the line of Eusebius somehow. Also, in the backdrop, there is Numenius, who was read in the Plotinus school, who speaks of lamp from lamp. And we know that Eusebius was against this reading. We know that Arius was against this reading. The final of this text is just negating or saying no to this approach. But in origin, we have a tension, and this is the core of what I'm trying to say. Because when we go, for example, to this passage, this text in the commentary on John, we can see how, for Origen commenting on the prologue, it was clear that the Logos was eternal, not just eternal in the sense of before the aeons, so it's not just a middle temporality, it was really eternal. It was really belonging to the only spiritual dimension that was this dimension of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And everything else was marked by a bodily dimension somehow, a thing for the angels, but the difference was between purely spiritual and bodily. And the Logos is in the beginning, that is purely spiritual, so it's purely eternal. But at the same time, in the very prologue, we can find that the Logos became flesh in favor of human beings, and this light and this life have also what we will call, we will say later, an economical dimension. And at this level, the category of Chrêseis is identified with the history of salvation. So the Chrêseis are always for, in favor, always related to pronoia, to salvation. So, in some sense, we have origin with a clear distinction between the three divine persons, who are defined spiritually, and the recourse to the participatory mechanism process to distinguish the Father from the Son and the Holy Spirit. So they don't share, they are not characterized by the same doxa, the same glory, but the Father is the glory. On the contrary, the Son receives some glory and gives to the Holy Spirit, and the same for beauty, good, and everything. So there is a metousia within the divine dimension. And Arius somehow brought that participatory dimension to a middle eternity, not a pure eternity that is in between. So Arius is recognized as a sort of gray zone between the Word and God. And we see this also in this tension in origin, and also this is related, for example, to the very recourse of power. Dynamis is in between, the Father and the Son. Just as for the... So this is how origin overcomes the apologists' approach of Logos being the bridge between God and creation, becoming from a faculty of God, becoming a sort of hypostasis for creation. And talking about the derivative formulas, we can recognize in origin the use of life from life, where the context is quite clear, and makes evident that he's using, even in the manuscript it's impossible to read this, is using the first life with small l and the second life with capital L, because there is derivation from the source that is a different being, a different ousia. And Eusebius is clearly against a Sabellian approach like in Marcellus, and he criticized his idea of the perfect begetting the perfect, the king begetting the king, exactly through the ek. So the ek is meant to express the fact that the Father and the Son are two different ousiae. But my question is, and maybe the key question of Nicaea is that ek eternal or not? In which sense? Also going back to Roman's lecture yesterday. This is the key, because in Eusebius we find the concept of deuteron aetion. We find the expression of the Son as a different ousia, we find metousia, different glory, just as in origin. But the recourse to glory from glory, light from light, is different, because in some sense the Logos is in between the Father and the creatures, and this structure is also has also a political meaning. This sort of political theology, because the emperor somehow can become the image of God, the image of the Logos, and the sea is for citizens, not just for Roman citizens, not just for creatures in that regard. And Samuel Fernandez is stressing a lot these two very interesting texts that for light from light are really important, because we can see here how Eusebius admits that the light and the ray are coeternal or contemporary, but instead the Son is not contemporary with the Father. And that instead, that is just a the, is quite important for his theology. And so In Eusebius we have light from light that maybe is pointed to a sort of a Gesellschaft. So the aim is the emperor, and to justify the theologically that something very good that happened to Christendom, it was peace and so on. On the contrary, in Alexander, we have the light from light is expressing eternity, and this eternity is just the eternity of the Father and the Son, because in that way there is an homotimia, identity of worship for the Father and the Son. So we get to orthodoxy, and sorry, in my reading, two key texts in Arius and in Eusebius are how the passages where they deny that the Logos belongs to the relative, ta prosti. Because a reading of phos et photos in the line of Alexander would imply that the act is relational. But if the act is eternal, that means that the relationships are within the divine ousia. And this is a different metaphysics. It's not Plotinus, this is a breakthrough is the reshaping of metaphysics. I published a book on the Cappadocian reading, so maybe I fear always anachronism to read from the Cappadocian back. But I think that in this regard, I tried to check with Samuel if I'm reading too much. So for example, this is a text by Arius, criticizing Alexander, so it's quite not biased on Alexander, and it's evident that the co-eternity, the co-eternity, of the Son and the Father is the key point. I skipped some of these texts, and you will see more. And I go to converge to the end. I go to the symbol of Caesarea. We don't know if this is the starting text, but we know that this expresses what Eusebius had in mind. And here we can see that there is the phos ek photos and the zoe ek zoes. On the contrary, the second article part of the symbol of Nicaea doesn't have the life from life. And this is my question: why? What happened? Why just life from life disappeared? And so life from life is also of philosophical origin, just as homoousios, as we know. So the real meaning cannot come from this. On the contrary, I'm sorry for the colors. I'm not too much aesthetical, so they're really bad. But maybe this is orthopraxy. Maybe they're useful. I don't know. So above you have Caesarea, and below you have Nicaea. So in Caesarea we have Jesus Christ, Logos, and then immediately the formula with God from God, light from light, and life from life. And then we have the begotten, with this is perfect, and not an aorist. On the contrary, in Nicaea we have Jesus Christ, Son. So the first part, the starting point is sonship. Then we have begotten, and begotten with the aorist, not with the perfect. And ek tesousia is explaining what begotten means in the aorist. And then we have God from God, light from light, and true God from true God. That is trying to close the formula light from light, just as after the derivative formulas, we have, again, repetition, begotten, uncreated, and consubstantial, the homoousios. So we have a parallel between the first begotten and the second begotten, and two addition with a vocabulary related to substances, to substance and metaphysics, to explain what they were saying. So in my opinion, in my reading, the shift from orthodoxy to from orthopraxy to orthodoxy was the attempt to combine, to read the light from light through this God from God and true God from true God, having recourse in the end to some text from John. It's true light, true God, everything comes from John. It's a reading of the prologue again. And this is my suggestion. In some sense, they are taking the structure from the very prologue, where you can read, you can dispose the first part and the second part of the prologue around sonship in a way that has a chiastic structure somehow. So even the form of the symbol of Nicaea, that in my opinion was a product of a long discussion, that was really deep, is trying to express this homoousios, so they are trying to bring the logos into the divine substances. So my conclusions are that we have many Chrêseis and Nicaea because of the new context. The Basilica is just an example of this shift from orthopraxy to orthodoxy. Light from light is more central than the very homoousios, because homoousios is in function of light from light. And these different Chrêseis are related to origin theology, and this is the drama. The drama comes from origin. And Eusebius chose one side out of orthopraxis, and on the contrary, Alexander stressed co-eternity and correlativity to get orthodoxy. And this symmetrized formula is trying to make emerge the relational dimension of the logos of the Son. And this has to do with the structure of the prologue of John. Thanks a lot, and sorry for being so quick. Now it's a pleasure for me to give the floor to Professor Alfons Fürst, who is going to talk from there. So maybe you can bring with you this, Alfons. He studied in Remus, but his career developed in Luther, where he founded the Orphan Center of Units, and he has published tons of books. He's an incredible editor too. And I just might to recall his books on freedom in the fathers, published in German. It's a terrific book that I do recommend. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh no, I have to turn on this micro. Now it's better? Okay, great. So thank you very much, Luis, for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I am speaking about Nicaea as a conflict in the media, so about the role of letters in the Arian crisis. The early phase of the disputes around the Council of Nicaea was conducted almost exclusively by means of letters, and it is documented in letters. We have only individual pieces and fragments, as you know, but these letters reveal the central role that the writing of them played in this conflict. This is probably no coincidence. The epistolary form was the medium of public debate par excellence in antiquity, which is why the parties involved in the dispute made use of this medium in a variety of ways. I shall thus describe the various usage of letters in the controversies around the council. That's my first part. And my second part is to ask what that means for our perception and description of this conflict. And some of you in the audience might wonder why I'm going to speak about Nicaea. I have never worked on history of dogma and so on, and I'm not inclined to do that. But the background is that I was editing a handbook on letters in antiquity together with two colleagues, which will appear in a few months in 2 thick volumes. And in dealing with this stuff, I came across these letters. And out of this perspective, they are quite interesting. And so I give you some remarks on that from this view, maybe from a bit outside. But sometimes it might be helpful to look at something from a bit more far away. So, first point. All parties involved in the disputes around the council wrote letters to promote their beliefs and forge alliances. Even the few letters that we still have reveal the high intensity of the epistolary campaign that was conducted in the initial phase of the dispute over the Christian concept of God. In the encyclical letter, which Alexander of Alexandria wrote in 324 to his fellow ministers of the Catholic Church everywhere, to inform them about the excommunication of those around Arius, as he always says, he admits straight away that he uses the medium of letters to propagandize his own cause. As Eusebius of Nicomedia had taken up the cause of those around Arius and written letters everywhere to solicit support, Alexander felt compelled, as he writes, to react in turn and warn against the activities of Eusebius of Nicomedia and again those around Arius with a circular letter. Because of lack of time, I skipped the longer quotations. What Alexander describes from his partisan point of view was the case from the very beginning at all sides. Letters were not only written but also solicited, which Alexander of Alexandria reproached the Arians for, interspersed with heresiological polemics. Only one sentence: for they, the Arians, they are going around the cities desiring nothing other than to give and receive letters through hypocrisy and flattery, under the pretense of friendship and in the name of peace. The letters requested served to support one's own position. In a letter dated 323, Eusebius of Nicomedia bluntly called on his colleague Paulinus of Tyre to support the epistolary campaign in favor of Arius, writing a letter himself to Alexander of Alexandria, because Eusebius believed that Paulinus was in a position to convince Alexander. And it's a quite bold and strong, harsh language in this letter to enforce this. Signatures were also collected for the same purpose of gaining support. For example, by Alexander of Alexandria having his letter to Alexander of Byzantium co-signed by fellow ministers. And this practice was related to the ecclesiastical device of the letter of communion, as can be seen from a remark made by Alexander in the same letter. It happens, he writes, that certain people adding signatures to their letters receive them into the church. Such a procedure was used to declare church communion, which in this case, however, violated church rules, as a cleric, here Arius and his companions, excommunicated by his bishop, here Alexander, could only be readmitted into church communion by his own bishop, not by another one. Thus, the very specific aim of the letter that Alexander wrote to his namesake in Byzantium was to prevent the group of clerics around Arius, whom he had excommunicated, from being granted church communion. He writes, "So let none of these anathematized men be received by the brotherhood, nor let their words and writings be upheld." And so that Alexander in Byzantium knows exactly who he should deny church communion to, the Alexandrian bishop adds the names of the excommunicated clerics to the end of his letter. I skip these names now. So in this dispute, ecclesiastical correspondence was therefore used by all parties involved in a targeted campaign to write letters and collect signatures in favor of or against the group around Arius. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria had an institutional advantage, because he had the infrastructure of the Alexandrian Church, with its considerable resources and the necessary messengers at his disposal for sending letters in numerous copies. The letter to Alexander was not only sent to Byzantium through a deacon named Appian, stated in the letter, but also he writes to all of Egypt and the Thebaid, as well as to Libya, Pentapolis, Syria, and further to Lycia, Pamphylia, Asia, Cappadocia, and the other lands around it. Alexander even sent personalized versions of the same tome in accordance with the addresses, as we can infer from some hints in the letter. Arius, on the other hand, and a group of presbyters and deacons around him were on their own in this respect, which is why they had no choice but to seek support from other bishops like Eusebius of Caesarea and Eusebius of Nicomedia, who had the appropriate institutional resources. An important means of group and identity formation that went hand in hand with this campaign was the massive use of heresiological topics and polemics. The letters were used less for theological argumentation, even though this does occur in them, I come back to this, and more for the purpose of closing one's own arrays and distinguishing oneself from the others. Alexander of Alexandria's letter to Alexander of Byzantium is a prime example of this. Although the main part of the letter deals with the theology of the Arians and Alexander's own concept of God, the framing shows the actual purpose of the letter. It is a combat letter. The focus is not on theological argumentation, as said, but on fighting his opponents. The letter begins with a long list of accusations against initially unnamed, depraved men, whom Alexander accuses of having a power-loving and money-loving inclination, which has been naturally disposed to plot against the ecclesiastical communities. And again, through manifold pretexts, such men set themselves against ecclesiastical piety, and so it goes on and on and on. The language of them and us appears here continually, which is typical of this type of conflictual group building. A clear front is presented with equally clear judgments. These men, Alexander continues, bring charges against every pious apostolic belief. They bound together a gang to fight against Christ, and so on. And so on. I don't have to quote now all these remarks or these insults. In his letter to Alexander of Byzantium, Alexander makes use of the entire arsenal of early church heresy polemics. It's basically all there. The main accusation is that of dividing the church. They have publicly torn Christianity to pieces. The devil was behind their actions, a common insult against heretics, and they were also misguided by pagan and Jewish ideas. The moral integrity of the opponents is called into question throughout. They are driven by greed and lust for power. Their behavior is morally dubious. Alexander most frequently accuses those around Arius of insincerity and hypocrisy. He warns his addressee to be careful, as he writes, lest one of them dare to approach your community either in person, for sorcerers are capable of acting in deceit, or through cleverly fabricated letters, which are able to mislead someone who has attended to a simple and pure faith. With their letters and sermons, according to Alexander, they try to deceive the gullible Christians. And in the encyclical letter on the excommunication of Arius, Alexander compares the Arians to chameleons who change their minds according to need. So he revels in highly rhetorical polemics as characteristic for the heresiological literature of the early church. A last point on this first part. The emperor's intervention made this public conflict, which was conducted by letters, even more acute. It became more polarized out of self-interest. Alexander of Alexandria, in particular, wrote so polemically in the encyclical letter in heresiological clichés because he had to justify his behavior to the emperor. It was not he, as he stressed, who was the troublemaker, but what Arius and others were claiming represented a massive threat to the doctrine and unity of the church. In his letter to Alexander of Byzantium, he had already portrayed himself as a victim in a typical perpetrator-victim reversal. I, as one suffering, he says. He has excommunicated Arius. I am suffering. The emperor's intervention meant that the conflict was now played out in the most publicized setting imaginable in the Roman Empire. And because the emperor was not really interested in the theological issues, but instead forced a quick agreement at the council, they played even less a role than was already the case from the outset. So that was a rough depiction of this polemical letter warfare going on here. Now I come to my second part, some possible effects on the theological debate. And I allow myself now some critical remarks on what's going on there, and let's be a bit bold just to spark discussion on that, so to stress the point a little bit. The main effect of these polemical demarcations and group formations was that the debate on theological issues suffered in various respects. As the letters written in this controversy are about group formation, external demarcation, and internal identity creation, the fronts are drawn with a rough brush. It is not about differentiation. Firstly, this affected the presentation of the respective opposing positions, especially that of Arius. Most accusations leveled against him by Alexander of Alexandria cannot be substantiated. The charge of hypocrisy is completely unfounded. No textual evidence backs Arius' alleged hypocrisy. Alexander's claims about the theology of Arius, namely that he denies the divinity of our Savior and proclaims him to be equal to all, are also consistently false, as I would really say. Arius did not deny the divinity of the Son, but explicitly referred to him as fully God in his letter to Eusebius of Nicomedia. He also did not say that the Son was equal to all other creatures, but explicitly distinguished him from the creatures created in space and time in the letter he wrote with his companions to Alexander of Alexandria, even though he described him as a creature, using biblical language. The only begotten Son before the age-long times, by whom he has made the ages and all things, a perfect creature of God, but not like one of the creatures. This charge applied, however, to other clerics associated with Arius, and others affirmed that the Son is one among the creatures. So Alexander just mixes up the divergent statements and throws it all on Arius. And finally, the charge that they even say that the Son's nature is mutable, capable of both virtue and vice, is contradicted by Arius' explicit statement that the Son is immutable and unalterable. And there is a complex problem behind that about the soul of Christ. I cannot go into this, but this is the core theological behind. So, these statements by Arius were not only ignored by Alexander, but also later by Athanasius. The polemical topos of duplicity of those of Arius was further developed by Athanasius and has had a profound hermeneutical impact on ancient and modern readers of the sources. The narrative they created was followed by dogmatic historiography almost without exception, so that Arius went down in history as arch-heretic who regarded Christ as a creature, like all other creatures, and denied his divinity. Poor presbyter of Alexandria. Secondly, the authors of these battle letters were not interested in theological differentiations because that would have undermined their intention. Because the aim of these letters was to forge alliances and close arrays, they present the theological questions involved in a simplified and crude way. In his presentation of Arian theology in the letter to Alexander of Byzantium, which is the earliest account of the Arian doctrine, these 4 or 5 chapters, and in the sweeping summary of the views of those around Arius in the encyclical letter, Alexander mixed up the divergent statements of the theologians who belonged to the group around Arius without being too precise about it. In presenting his own theology, he proceeds in such a way that he specifically emphasizes the opposite of the views that he attributes to Arius and his followers. Clear opposites are presented here. Not like this, but like this. This is the structure of Alexander's argument throughout this letter. It is about clearly profiling his own position over against the views attributed to his opponents, not about an in-depth discussion of the tricky question of the relationship between Father and Son in the one God. There are only 2 passages in Alexander's letter to his namesake in Byzantium in which he makes a nuanced observation. The Arians, he says, only focus on the biblical passages that deal with the salvation, historical and soteriological humiliation of the Son, but ignore those that express his undiminished divinity. So Alexander certainly seems to have recognized that this whole dispute about the relationship between Father and Son in the Christian concept of God was essentially about the interpretation of biblical passages that played a role in this problem, and not least also about the correlation of humanity and divinity in Christ. But he did not go into this any further, as he explicitly states at the end of his reflections. This rhetorical technique can be seen in all the letters written during this dispute. None of them, not even the letters of Arius, contain theologically differentiated and carefully developed arguments. Even where theological ideas do occur, they are more like slogans. Slogans that function as identity markers. This can be clearly observed in the letter of the Council of Nicaea to the churches of Egypt, Libya, and the Pentapolis, where only statements and terms are listed that are condemned as blasphemous expressions and terms of the impiety and lawlessness of Arius and those who are with him. This is, of course, related to the character of such a synodal letter, in which only the results of theological debates and the final decisions are communicated. However, it is also typical of the letter warfare that was carried out in the early phase of the Arian controversy. In such public conflicts carried out in letters, theological argumentation was neglected in favor of networking and the creation of identity for one's own group. The form and style of this controversy may have had even more far-reaching consequences. And I come to my short last part. Only some thoughts to think about. We can see these consequences even in the creed formulated at the Council of Nicaea itself. Now a bit critical look at that text. In the question of the pre-cosmic origin of the Son, which was at the center of this debate, the text of the creed placed all emphasis on the identity of Father and Son in God, without addressing the question of difference. This may have to do with the fact that, in opposition to Arius, the divinity of the Son was emphasized without making any concessions. This ensured that God's salvation was truly present in Jesus Christ. And in my view, this is the big outcome of this creed and this council, that in Jesus we really encounter God. So this was made clear by this formula. However, because the divinity of the Son was clearly distinguished from the theology that Arius was accused of, the gap between creator and creation was made so wide that it could hardly be bridged, and subsequently created a massive problem that led to centuries of discussion in Christology regarding the relationship between divinity and humanity in Jesus Christ. The interpretation of the events surrounding the Council of Nicaea It seems important to take the genre in which this controversy was fought out seriously into account. The sources are not theological treatises, but letters. And sometimes, to have a critical remark on ourselves, I have the impression we read them as if they were theological treatises, but they are specific letters written in certain contexts. These letters, which were apparently written in large numbers and of which only very few are preserved, served to form identities and set boundaries. Accordingly, polemics, defamation, simplification, and distortion dominate. These combat letters were not a forum for detailed and differentiated theological debates. It was all about slogans that could be used to rally one's own supporters and defame opponents. For the return of theology in a more complex and extensive form, we have to wait for the Cappadocians and with a new approach for Augustine. That's a last bold state just to make us think what happened at Nicaea, what's going on there. Thank you very much.
I wanted to do that.
There's a Greek rhetorical thing called Chrêseis and Chrêseis, which takes the form of not that put this spoof out. And I wonder that the Greek exchange with Christopher Steve, who's written a book on rhetorical method and Athanasius, and had not noticed this particularly. Unfortunately, I didn't myself know the name of the technical term at the time. But there's nothing wrong with that. The issue of Nicaea is very much a new issue. Is there a subordination straight to divinity, or is the Son truly God? Now you said that Athanasius agreed that the Son was fully, that Arius agreed that the Son was fully God. I'm not sure how you could have said this, because even Eusebius wrote a letter shortly before the council saying you cannot call the Son Theos Letimus, only the Father, John 17:3. On the other hand, 1 John 5:20 says he is truly God and eternal life, which is a bit, seems to refer to the Son as truly God. In any case, Athanasius quotes this without comment and I think more in sadness than in anger, and perhaps knowing that after Nicaea, Eusebius would never speak like that again. I just think the fact that they discussed in letters surely is a good thing, because it's a whole bunch of people involved. Samuel Fernandez's account shows a very complex debate going on. If they had been writing longer treatises, it wouldn't perhaps have been so any better. And also, you said we waited the Cappadocians and Augustine. No, we waited Athanasius, and Athanasius is a very refined theologian. He wrote
Of course, I expected basically this contradiction. I'm thinking on very different lines. So, we follow too much the accounts of Eusebius, and we follow too much the accounts of Athanasius. Of course, I would agree that also in Athanasius we find theological thinking, of course, that's that. But he is still more involved in these controversies going on and highly polemical, constructing these boundaries. So, but I agree, Athanasius has theology as well. My point is, on this with fully God, it's written in one of these letters of Arius. And we always simply ignore it, because it does not fit to the narrative later created by these guys. So what I want to do out of a critical historical perspective is to get out of it. And then I switch totally to go back to that. I'm coming from Origen, so from the other side. And then I really would like to make a case, but this would require another lecture, to delete the word subordinationism. It's fully misleading in my view, because it does not grasp the real problem. Because this problem of subordinationism, they all have it. Because if there is only one source in a strict sense of life and being, and this source is the Father, then all others are in a way subordinated to that. So this is not a term by which we can grasp the problem. The problem, as I would frame it, is about identity and difference. There is a problem if Christians are monotheists and they think of one God, and this one God is the source of all being and life and so on. But this life is not one, it's a multitude. And if you want to create a multitude out of the one, you need an aspect of differentiation in the one. And this is the big problem in philosophical debates and in theological debates as well. And this is, for example, now I shorten it, what Origen is doing. He always tries to find out identity and difference between Father and Son related to this problem when he explains all these biblical passages. So the Father and I are one, the Father is greater than me, and so on. And all, you know all these passages, they are all there. So he tries to balance identity and difference to come to a concept. The start of this debate, in my view, is a dispute in the Alexandrian tradition. And Eusebius, Arius, Alexander, they are all moving within this concept. But in my view, they get one-sided. Eusebius of Caesarea emphasizes too much the difference, as I would see it. Arius overemphasizes the difference. So this is why I think Arius in the end went wrong, but not because of what was attributed and later to him. And Alexander emphasizes too much the identity. And I think the Creed of Nicaea emphasizes also the identity, which is fine, because of the outcome that Jesus is God, but the difference is missing. Alois Grillmeier already noticed this in his book Christ and Christian Tradition. He got this point. And this is how we should think about this debate, what's going on, and this you will not find in these texts. Now, these texts always draw clear demarcations and overstress the points of the others. So that's a long answer, sorry. Yeah. Time is over.